evening, campers, it's me, Kira, and today we are going to talk about Dan Simmons' Hyperion. One thing that I want to stress in regards to Hyperion is that this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. The subject that captivated me in my undergraduate, which led me on to continue this on to my master's thesis, and then led me to do a PhD on this, is Romantic Legacies. Romantic Legacies is the studies of the Romantic poets and seeing how they have formed literature today. Now, in order to talk about Hyperion, you have to talk about Hyperion by John Keats. Thus, allow me to state, if you are going to read Hyperion, or that you have read Hyperion, it is imperative that you understand the source material. You need to read Hyperion by Keats, because Simmons's Hyperion is so entrenched in the work of John Keats. In fact, the planet that we're on is called Keats. So before I'm going to talk about the sci-fi classic, I'm going to talk about the Romantic poet. Allow me to stress, Hyperion is an unfinished poem. Right at the end of book 3, we abruptly cut off. Though Keats was to die young at the age of 25, he didn't finish it because he died. He actually just abandoned it. He felt as though he was moving into the Miltonic, and in fact, he wanted to write Hyperion to create his own Miltonic epic poem, and thus the Hyperion cantos were formed. Keats's Hyperion tells the story of the old gods being overthrown by the new, and with the new gods, they don't so much replace, but they advance the old gods. And Hyperion is the last titan to be overthrown. Hyperion, the sun god, is to be superseded by Apollo, who is not only the sun god, but also the god of poetry. Hyperion, akin to Paradise Lost, throws you in at the middle of the story, and nothing really advances here. At the cut-off point in book 3, Apollo, who has been engaged in conversation with the goddess of memory, decides to then usurp Hyperion. The final lines of Hyperion is Apollo shrieking, his arms outstretched, celestial. To navigate Keats's poem to the layman, Apollo then is to usurp Hyperion, and we're only going to find out what happens in the next of the cantos, that being the fall of Hyperion, which is Dan Simmons' second novel. And therefore, in order to read the Hyperion cantos of Simmons, you need to read all of the Hyperion cantos of Keats. Yet I want to reiterate something. As I mentioned, Hyperion starts in the middle of the action, and then through recounting stories of the old titans and the new god, we end at the moment that Apollo is to overthrow Hyperion. And the reason for that is that Keats didn't see Hyperion as being a story full of action. That was not the purpose of it. Its purpose was to talk about poetry itself. As such, I would argue that Dan Simmons' Hyperion is not so much about the story or the plot, it's about storytelling. Simmons is wholly captivated by Keats's poetry and articulates it in such a way that makes his interpretation of Keats's Hyperion wholly accessible. The intertextual but also the paratextual relationship that Simmons is bringing to Keats, it's just something that I really appreciate. You do need to appreciate Keats. You need to understand the source material, and that at times is going to be difficult. As I mentioned, Keats died at a young age, and his ideas about what poetry was to achieve, and it's also worth understanding that in regards to the satanic school of poetry which Keats falls under, the movement towards liberation, the want to express and the freedom in which to do so is vitally important to all of the satanic poets. There are two Keatsian poetic concepts that I think you should understand if you are to pick this up, if you are to revisit it or to reread it at some point. These two are wholly evident within Dan Simmons' work, and they are negative capability and the mansion of many apartments. Keats would outline these concepts within letters and correspondence, but because he died at such a young age, we don't really have a breadth of his poetry. Although if you are to read Keats's poetry in chronological order, the way in which it matures and develops is unfathomable. You go down a rabbit hole reading various different interpretations of what negative capability are and the mansion of many apartments. But negative capability can really be seen in his ode to a nightingale. My reading of negative capability is the placement of the artistic and the aesthetic over the philosophical. Therefore, to mention, if not the key idea of Romanticism, is the idea of the sublime. And we see this in Hyperion. The landscape, everything on Hyperion as a planet is sublime. The reason why I mentioned Ode to the Nightingale is, one, it is Keats's most well-read works. It's also very short, so rather than jumping into Hyperion, again, I really think that you should do that, but Simmons repurposes the idea of the nightingale and repurposes it into the Shrike. The Shrike is this ethereal, eternal being that is the harbinger of death. The image of the Shrike is very dreamlike in nature. In talking about the Shrike, Dan Simmons is not only referencing the bird of the Shrike that impales insects and lizards onto thorny trees, which is one of the favoured execution methods by the Shrike, but there's also a little bit of wordplay. Shrike and shriek are also anagrams of each other, and Apollo shrieked, his arms outstretched, celestial. Before we get too carried away, let's walk ourselves back. We still have to talk about the mansion of many apartment, which was the metaphor that Keats used to explore human life. And we can see this evident within Paul Duray's account of when he encounters the Shrike within the labyrinth secluded underneath Hyperion. Within the labyrinthine, Duray encounters the crucible where he is to experience eternal life alongside the Bakura. This idea of eternal life, or if not rejuvenating life, is evident, you guessed it, within Keats's Hyperion, where the mention of the phoenix and the symbolic connotations of the phoenix is to persuade Apollo to take over Hyperion. Simmons's Hyperion is a field day on Keats, and a question that you might ask yourself is, well, why would you take an epic poem from the Romantics and reimagine it as a sci-fi novel? Like, where is the connotation here? Well, not only, and I've said it twice, so I might as well stress it a third time, Apollo shrieked, his arms outstretched, celestial. We have that image. But in regards to the paratextual, Keats, when he talks about reading Homer, says that poetry is like seeing a new planet come into being, hence the sci-fi element. For the pilgrims of the human homogeny who are to take their trip of 2 light minutes and 5 hours to meet the Shrike at the time tombs, this is just Romanticism 101. If you are encaptured by the Romantics, or if you want to experience Romanticism without reading the 19th century stuff that is somewhat dry, Simmons has done all the legwork for you. As Hyperion was about poetry, Hyperion is about storytelling, and these pilgrims need to tell their stories to understand why they have been chosen, what is their purpose, why they are embarking to meet the Shrike. And we'll realise, just like the new gods of which the pilgrims take the role of, they are not only replacing what has come before, but they are advancing the present. Fully aware that I have used this sci-fi classic to basically talk about Keats and my passion for Romanticism and of Keats's poetry, especially in his much less regarded epic poetry. But nevertheless, Dan Simmons's Hyperion is superb. I didn't think Hyperion was going to be so close to Hyperion. It was everything that I kind of wanted it to be. The reason why I think people won't like this is in the fact that Hyperion by Keats ends abruptly and there's no real action. And as this is so closely intertwined with Hyperion, the end might feel a little bit lackluster. So while I was waiting with nervous apprehension, I wasn't expecting Dan Simmons to commit that far, but he did, and I appreciated that. I could see some readers getting to the end of this, shrieking, arms out celestial. His knowledge, understanding, and appreciation of Keats. While some people might get annoyed that it is quite on the nose. You can't deny that he's paying homage. Hyperion for me is a 9 out of 10 because Simmons makes a subject, makes an era, makes a mode accessible. I know people are apprehensive about poetry, and maybe in my talking of Keats I'm not helping you, but I want you to understand you shouldn't be apprehensive about the romantic poet. You shouldn't feel nervous, and you shouldn't feel like a lot of people say that they're not smart enough or they won't understand it, because if you can read this and you can enjoy it and you see how Dan Simmons is making the Keatsian notions relatable to you, the ideas that propel the characters, that propel the just everything about this makes me just elated in a way that I can't quite apprehend. This is such a wonderful pastiche and homage to an author who not many people will read, a poet who not many people appreciate but will understand from reading Hyperion. And I hope that people go back to read Keats to see how this small group of British authors revolutionised literature, revolutionised the way that we tell stories, revolutionised the way that we see the world. And Hyperion does it. It is astonishing to me. It is astonishing to me that a space opera on Keats works.